Eddie, no. It's my cat over there. Eddie, no. Let me get this cat's crazy. No. Oh, come on, Eddie. He wants to go outside. He's really spoiled with that. But not right now.
Hey, Professor, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm just getting home right now, so I'm like getting my stuff ready. So
Perfect. Yeah. Who are you? I see you. It's not listed in the chat. It's just iPhone.
I thought it was Aaron Perez.
Okay, cool. Hey, Aaron.
Yes, this is Aaron Perez, though. Hello.
Not to worry. Yeah. How are you? Good to see you.
Good. Mm-hmm. Just getting home from work, so
yeah, it's about that time, right? Probably had to.
Yep.
Sitting in traffic or what?
5 o'clock, and then I get there as soon as I can. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, I know how it is when you're trying to drive around at like 5 to 6. It's not the best time, but maybe you avoided the worst of it. That's not so bad. Yes, this is my cat. You guys see Eddie over there. He's well, I have 2 cats. His sister Peachy, she's running around. He's he's very smart in his own way. He's very intuitive. He's got a lot of emotional intelligence. But yeah, he's unique. He's unpredictable. He's very loyal and very needy cat. But yeah, he's great. He's a big boy. He's 1 year old. He's about to be 2 in a couple months. Yeah, sometimes I got to give him a little attention if he starts crying. So that's why I pulled him up here. Now hopefully he's satisfied. Just a couple minutes, guys, and we'll get started. The myth of Sisyphus, yes. Just, I guess, pushing that rock, up the hill or whatever to infinity for all time. That's just kind of like his task in life. Yeah, I mean, I feel like Eddie might have a little more existential angst than Peachy. He's got a lot of desire. Takes a lot to make him feel content, but Peachy's always just kind of relaxed. So, I don't know. Sisyphus, is he content? I think they say there's a famous quote, we must imagine Sisyphus happy as he pushes the rock up. So maybe that throws off my analysis a little bit. Is there a Discord for the class, Christian? I'm not sure. That's something that you have to consult with some of your classmates on. But I'm sure they'll be able to point you to it. And there probably is one, but I'm not personally aware just yet. Okay, just another few moments. All right, everybody, we're at 5:30 now, so I'm just going to get our class started. Welcome back to everyone here. It's really good to see you guys. And, it's not like I'm keeping an attendance record formally, but feel free to just say hello one time in the chat. That also give you a little familiarity using our chat interface. And then I can just sort of see the listed out names. Hey there, Remick, Lauren, Monica, Merlin, Brian, Natalie, Ashley, Drew, Christian, Nicholas, Arturo, Case, Luke, Julian, Giovanni, Carl, Aaron, Casimiro. Thanks, everybody. I see all your names, and I'm glad that we're here together again. So I'm glad that you're able to find the class meeting. And Joseph, notice, Christian, that Joseph has the Discord there listed in the chat, so you can follow that link to gain access to it if you want. All right. Well, we had our introductory meeting on Monday, and now today we're really going to start diving into the actual course content and material. I'm glad you guys were able to find the meeting by navigating the announcements that I sent out. We only have virtual meetings for the first 2 weeks, but for the time being, that's how you will locate the upcoming link, which I'll always post after the current class meeting for the next one that's coming up. And you'll notice also that I put the office hour link in that same message. That's over with now, but for next week's Monday and Wednesday office hours, I'll also include the links for those in my next messages sent to you through Canvas. So let's just begin at the beginning. This is a class in contemporary moral issues, and broadly speaking, that means that this is a course within the realm of ethics. So I kind of just wanted to get a broad discussion and a couple of notes established on the basic topic of ethics, what ethics is in general, and then we will, telescope in to the more detailed theories of ethics and morality that we're going to learn on in this first few weeks. So ethics, that is our subject matter. And I don't know, do any of you guys have any associations that you draw from the word ethics? Like, what other kind of buzzwords or concepts pop up in your mind if somebody says ethics? Like, what do you believe ethics is about, if you could put it in other words or give a more full description of it? Anybody can let me know, whether you're using the chat or the mic. So I see one comment coming in that it has to do with morality, and that's correct. Yes, fair. So ethics is about morality and the moral spectrum of life. Questions concerning, Giovanni, you say fairness. Yes, that's one element of ethics, because people talk about it being right to be fair and wrong to be unfair. So Merlin, right and wrong. Yes, very good. Natalie, you say someone's judgment of good and bad. Correct. Christian, I like you give a specific example, whether or not to steal your brother's food. Yes. So what is coming into focus here? The behavior that we ought to do. That's also very good, Joseph. These are all on point. And what it seems is that you all have a basic, common, just human understanding of the topic of ethics, which is going to be our focus throughout the whole semester. Ethics is the study of morality and moral concepts within philosophy. That's what we think of it to be. So that's it. It is the study of morality and moral concepts. Okay, so that's what ethics is. And I'd like to just start us off. You guys are already deep into the analysis of whether or not to steal that food from the brother. Hey, we'll get into the question of morally permissible and impermissible actions just now, but this is our jump off point. We're talking about morality and moral concepts. That's the world of ethics. Now, moral concepts, some of them have already been provided by a few of you guys in the chat, and I'd like to kind of expand on those. So let's try and build out a little list of what are some moral concepts. And basically one way I think that would be good for us to illustrate these concepts would be to talk about like the two sides of an ethical judgment, or two different ways that we could regard an action ethically. So we talk about sometimes an action being blank versus blank. Some of you have already put these in the chat, but let's see it again. What do you think? In morality, ethics, etc., we talk about actions being, I don't want to give you the words, but you can supply them for me. Like on a positive or a negative side ethically, we have terms such as what? When we say an action is on the positive ethical side, we could describe it in what words? Permissible or not permissible? Very good, Joseph, yes. Permissible versus impermissible, meaning what one is permitted to do ethically versus what one is not permitted to do ethically. Yes, sometimes when we judge an action, we judge it and classify it in either of those ways. Madeline, also very good. Good versus bad. Ethical good versus bad. Not like a good versus bad I don't know, movie or something, but good versus bad in the moral sense of the term. I saw above a different student, and now you added again, Remick, right versus wrong. Right, wrong, good, bad, permissible, impermissible. Now I think you guys are kind of getting the general idea here. So another pair of contrasting moral concepts, moral versus, what's the contrary of moral? Let me know. Immoral, yes, there's another one, moral versus immoral. Okay, good and bad, right and wrong, moral and immoral. I don't know, just versus unjust. Is that another distinction? Yes. Sometimes we regard behaviors according to those terms. Saying of an action, a practice, a policy, or whatever, that it's a just one. Or no, maybe it was an unjust policy. Maybe somebody did something that was good, right, moral, or maybe they did something that was immoral, bad, or wrong. We could talk about virtue versus vice. That's another, I guess, pair of moral concepts that are sometimes included in our list. Virtue versus vice. And since ethics is so much about how we ought to act, as one of our students has mentioned above, you can also, I guess, place within this realm how a person ought to versus how they should not act. So I'm going to have to move to the other side really quick to get the room I need. But yeah. Okay, so these are just a kind of collection of moral terms and concepts. And when you're doing ethics or you're thinking about ethics, you're thinking about actions in these terms. The classification of behavior as right or wrong, the judgment of an individual's conduct as moral or immoral. In some general moral sense, how a person should act versus how they should not act morally. Sometimes you are the subject of moral judgments that other people make, and sometimes, of course, you're the moral judge that judges the actions of others or even of your own. So, as we learn about ethics, you may think that there's no kind of rigorous approach to it. There's no systematic way of classifying actions as moral or immoral. You may think that that's just something that is in the realm of subjective impressions that each person has, which are not universal. But actually, within ethical theory and in philosophy, there have been some highly detailed attempts to try and articulate what does make an action right or wrong in some sort of rational or objective sense. So we're going to learn about some big ethical theories, what they're called. These ethical theories give us explanations that try to tell us what makes an action count as one that is either good or bad. Now, there are three major kinds of actions within ethics, and I just want to mention those for us next, and we'll go over them. So, three main types of action in ethics. So in ethics, there's three general categories that an action can be placed in on the moral spectrum. So one category of actions are those that are deemed or classified as morally impermissible. Morally impermissible. A second category of actions, which is kind of just the reverse, are those that are thought to be morally permissible. And yet, a further and third possibility are the actions that are deemed morally obligatory. So, we're going to try and work through these terms to understand what each one means and what might be some fair examples of them. So going just from a level of common sense, I'm thinking that you might be able to interpret the meaning of that first term, morally impermissible. If somebody judges an action to be morally impermissible, what do you think that means, in other words? If it's morally impermissible, we would just say it's what kind of action? Anybody have a guess? Or a reasonable inference? Yeah, it's something that's wrong, and it's something that you should not do. That's exactly right, Sarah, Joseph, and Aaron. Yeah. So those are actions that are wrong, and perhaps less formally, they're just not okay to do. So actions that are wrong. And they're not okay to do. Morally, anyway, they're not okay to do. It's not that they're impossible to do, unfortunately, but people shouldn't be doing that. After all, not everything is morally appropriate or good or right. So now, looking at that term and the basic understanding that it's something that's wrong, it's not okay to do, let me ask some of you guys here if you can think of any examples of actions that would fit that description. So what could be some specific action types? Okay, so going straight to the top of premeditated murder, sure, but that's good, Joseph and Madeline. Certainly, that's one of the gravest moral wrongs that a person could commit, right? To take a person's life without proper cause, like self-defense or judicial punishment. So, of course, a person's life is theirs. It's not yours to choose whether or not to destroy, and that would be high up on the spectrum of how bad an action could be. But it's not the only wrong action, so I see some other examples too. Stealing would be another fair example. Say, taking a person's property without their permission or without some kind of valid transfer of ownership to you. That's another case of stealing that's wrong. Now, because we're going to get into all the complexities of these issues, could there ever be a conceivable scenario where someone thinks stealing is morally righteous? Possibly. Did I hear someone's comment? Sorry, I don't know if I heard the microphone if you wanted to make a comment, but let me know if you do. I was just going to say about the act of stealing that, maybe someone could argue, okay, well, my family, like my child is starving and I stole a loaf of bread to feed them. You might argue, okay, or like Robin Hood, yes, Aaron, stealing from the rich, giving to the poor. But without making it too complex, generally speaking, with some exceptions, stealing is regarded as wrong. And so that's a fair example too. Perhaps not as obviously wrong in every case as murder, but fair enough. Drunk driving, yeah, sure. It poses threat and harm to other people. It's reckless endangerment of their life. So certainly that's wrong. Cheating, yes. You have an obligation to abide by the rules institutionally that ensure that we have fair outcomes based on merit. Sarah, well, I hear a question in the direct message. It's asking me what determines what's moral and immoral. And that's really what we're going to be building up towards. It's going to take a while to explain. It's actually the basis of extremely complex theories. So it'll take us a little bit of like a couple of meetings to get into that. But we're working on that and we'll get there for sure. We will try and understand what have been some of the most intellectually respectable answers to that question. What makes an action count as moral or immoral? Okay, so look, guys. Lying, cheating, stealing, breaking promises, those would all be actions on the wrong side of morality that are morally impermissible. Christian, you asking, where would devil's advocate be? Well, my comprehension of devil's advocate is it's whenever a person advocates for a position in order to force people to supply better arguments against it, even if perhaps the person doesn't agree or believe in the position they're saying. So, like you may advocate for a position you don't believe in order to press your friend or opponent into providing a more precise argument. I don't know if this really falls within the scope of morality per se, unless you mean something else by devil's advocate, like a person doing something bad for a noble reason. But just advocating an argument in order to expand the space of rational considerations doesn't seem to me to be morally positive or negative in and of itself. But it's a very good question. So anyway, yeah, things that are morally impermissible cover a broad terrain. It could be all the way up to like murder, rape, torture, genocide, some of the worst things that are possible, all the way down to like private acts of lying, I don't know, cheating, infidelity, or whatever else. So we can now swing over to this, morally permissible. If actions that are morally impermissible are wrong, and they're not okay to do, what do you think it would mean to say an action is morally permissible, on the other hand? So, Joseph, you say actions that we ought to do, and Merlin, you say actions that are right. Case, if I'm getting your name right, it says something good to do. And that's all fair, but there's just one little kind of subtlety that I want to try and introduce here. So whenever I ask this question, as I always do at the beginning of this type of class, what do you think is morally permissible if these things are wrong and not okay? Naturally, the contrary of the word wrong is something right or good. And morally permissible, Kais, got you, thank you. Naturally, morally permissible makes you think, well, it's got to be the reverse of this. If this is wrong, this is right. Well, I would prefer to put it a little more minimally, just because when you think of the word right, you think of actions that involve like noble self-sacrifice for some kind of greater good. And yes, those are permissible for sure, but it's not limited to those. And so, Robert, you've got it. The right way I would put it is that they're simply actions that are not wrong. They're not wrong, and then they are okay to do. Okay, so let me put that here. Actions that are not wrong. And in other words, they are okay to do. So, what do you think could be an example or some examples of actions that are not wrong and they're okay to do? Eating breakfast. Okay, that's good, Giovanni, because notice that eating breakfast isn't really like changing the world or like, contributing to the greater good perhaps, but it's also not wrong. No one can say of a breakfast eater, shame on you, stop that right away, that's evil. So yes, that's permitted. Christian, would killing 1 to save 5 be permissible? It depends on the theory. So your question, I'll have to postpone the answer for a moment because there are different ethical theories which will provide different answers to your question. The one that we're going to study kind of says that it might be okay in some cases, but another theory that we'll develop after that says never. Giving to charity, yes. Studying, feeding the homeless, yeah. Giving blood, working at a food bank, all those things are morally permissible. So morally permissible acts, that also covers a very broad terrain. It's all the things that are just not wrong to do. And so it does include like acts of giving, acts of caring, acts of love and kindness, but it also includes all the little daily things that just don't have any kind of negative moral character. So like for me to wear this black sweater, that's morally permissible, even though it's not really contributing to the greater good in any sense. It's just not something that contravenes morality. Sarah, you say, wouldn't things that aren't wrong just be amoral, not good or bad? Well, they could be in the case you give of being amoral, but it's not limited to that. The point I was making, Sarah, is that yes, giving to charity, defending a person against a violent attacker, like intervening on their behalf, that is also morally permissible. So morally permissible includes both kinds of things that make a big positive impact, and also those things that just do not make a negative moral impact, you see. Joseph's question, is the scope of these actions limited to an individual or as a society? In moral theory, most of the universal moral theories that we study in ethics and philosophy don't say that morality is defined by social norms, because social norms themselves can sometimes be subject to moral criticism. Suppose, for example, there was a society that practiced as a given norm child sacrifice or child marriage. You might say that even though in that society it's approved of, it's actually wrong in some objective sense that's not socially constructed. So your question is subtle and interesting, but some people believe in what's called moral relativism or social or cultural relativism, but most of the moral theories that we study are not based on social or cultural standards and are rather based on like more fundamental rational considerations. At least that's how the authors try to describe them. Okay, so we've covered those things: morally impermissible, morally permissible. Some of the morally permissible actions are not necessarily even suitable to your best interests. Like if I took off my glasses right now and I just broke them in half, I guess since it's my property, that would be morally permitted as well, because I'm entitled to destroy my property if I really want, but it wouldn't really be very good for me or good for my best interests. So sometimes even the morally permissible acts are not well advised, even though we have to look at them on a case-by-case basis. I have another question in the DMs here, which says, impermissible actions are actions that hurt others for the benefit of oneself, and permissible actions that do not hurt others for the benefit of oneself. Generally, yes, but no, not every case. There could be immoral actions that don't involve others, at least according to some arguments that philosophers give. So like, I don't know, if I engage in self-harm, some people would say that that's wrong. Because I have a moral obligation not just to others, but to myself as well. So there's perhaps room for some discussion on that. But generally speaking, yes, impermissible acts are wrong according to some standard of right and wrong that we will develop here. And oftentimes they're bad for people, yes. Would it be impermissible if I broke someone else's glasses? Sure. Because again, that's kind of like a special case of the destruction of their property, something parallel to theft or in the realm of theft. Let's continue with this. What is a morally obligatory action, if anyone can guess? The word kind of helps you. It's a hint, a little bit of a giveaway. That's right, Joseph, yes. So those are moral actions that we're not just permitted to do, meaning we may do it, it's an option, but they're actions that morally we must do, and it would actually be wrong not to do them. So these are actions one must do. And it's wrong not to do. Okay, so oh yeah, no, it's good, Kais. We're taking it slow. We're taking it as slow as we possibly can. So the words we're learning one by one: morally impermissible, permissible, now obligatory. So a morally obligatory act is an act that, as the word indicates, it's an obligation. It's not something that you're supposed to be at liberty to decline from doing. So those are actions that you must do morally mandatory rather than optional. I don't know. These I've noticed are always a little harder for students to, first of all, try to give examples of, but I know that we can do it if we just focus on it for a minute. So, Sarah, you say take care of my children and pets if we have any. I would say yes, okay? So suppose that you have children, you've taken custody of them, not like giving them away for adoption or to a surrogate. In that case, we would argue, and I think it's fair to say it's a moral obligation, not just permissible to raise and care for these children, but a moral obligation to do so. And same with pets, because if you didn't want to have an obligation to care for the pet, you're obviously not required to take one on. So taking one on implies some kind of obligation to care for it. Reporting a crime, you say, Sarah? Perhaps, but it depends on the nature of the crime, because, and actually I'm going to talk with you guys about the difference between law and morality in just a moment, because they are different. But for example, people who gave safe harbor to Jewish people in the Holocaust, like the Anne Frank house and stuff, could have been considered criminals under the laws that existed in Nazi Germany, but it was not wrong to break those laws. And if you had reported a person for giving safe harbor like that because they were committing a crime, you would be doing something immoral, even though you would be reporting a crime. So because the legislators who institute the laws can themselves appoint immoral and unjust laws, like a law that says you can own slaves or whatever, or that it's wrong to escape slaves like Harriet Tubman did in the Underground Railroad, the laws themselves can be subject to moral criticism. So we should never conflate too easily the idea of law and morality. On the other hand, I don't want you to think like an anarchist that the laws are all immoral and they should be defied. For the most part, they're good and right, and they reflect our natural sense of justice and right and wrong. But legislators are not infallible gods, and they can and have in history sometimes put into place laws that people find morally objectionable. So we cannot say necessarily that reporting a crime is a moral obligation, but in the cases that I'm sure you're thinking of, like someone got raped, someone was being physically assaulted, yes, fair enough, but requires that little clarification. Taking care of your sick parents, sure, I would say so, Sheeta, but sometimes people may not have standing relationships with their parents, or they may have been harmed or abused by their parents. So I'm only going to introduce these kind of like counterexamples just to make you think twice that some of these answers are a little complicated. Voting, standing up for justice, that's certainly a civic obligation. Some people argue that civic participation is futile or whatever if they have really kind of jaded views about the government, but I don't really share those views myself, so I would tend to agree with you. Paying rent, Remick, sure. I mean, it's certainly a contractual obligation that you have, but there are cases in which maybe a person is undergoing financial hardship and you would think that they should be granted some kind of exception to the typical rule for at least a limited time. Let me give you some of my own as well. Keeping a promise is an easy example. Notice the difference again between law and morality here, because if I make a promise to somebody, I generate a moral obligation, but unless it's backed by an actual contract, it's not like a legally enforceable arrangement. So say that somebody wants me to pick them up from the airport to give them a ride home after they arrive, and I say, you know what, I promise you, I put it on everything and you can trust me, I swear to God or whatever, I will pick you up at that time. And now they're there waiting for me at the airport and they're like calling me, hey, you're about 30 minutes late. You're still coming, right? Like you promised. I'm like, yeah, I know I promised, but I'm definitely not coming because I just wanted to mess with you and get you stuck at the airport. You're a loser, blah, 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 just hang up. If I did that, that would be a violation of a moral obligation that I have to follow through on the content of the promise, but it's not a crime. It's not like I can be arrested for that cause. So it's worth noting that sometimes there can be actions that are illegal, but not necessarily morally impermissible, at least according to some people, right? Like, I don't know, freeing slaves would have been a crime at a certain point in American history, but to most all of us, we can agree that was not an immoral act. So sometimes the legal status of an act does not correspond to its moral status. And in the same way, there can be things that are morally obligatory, but they're not legally required either. So like, not littering, well, I guess there are laws about that, so I should strike that comment. But the one I just made about promising, like an informal promise, is another fair example of a moral but not a legal obligation. And telling your kids that Santa is real, well, Aaron, that's complicated, isn't it? It's a bit of a lie. So are you saying it's an obligation to tell them that it's real, or an obligation to tell them the truth? I'm not sure. I mean, probably they won't be harmed by believing in this falsehood, and probably that'll enhance the quality of their childhood a little bit, but they're bound to learn sooner or later that it was all a big conspiracy, won't they? Not to worry, though. So next thing for us is this. We would like to investigate the best writings in the Western tradition that try to give us some answers to what makes an act either impermissible, permissible, or obligatory. And there have been some very interesting ethical theories that try to give us those answers. So now we will go ahead and try and start developing the first of the big major ethical theories, and that is the theory of what's called utilitarianism, which was provided to us by John Stuart Mill in the 19th century. Moral obligation to our relationships. Well, you say customer's always right, Christian. That's kind of an American idea, but it's not really thought the same way if you go abroad. I challenge you to travel to Europe and start being pushy about your orders and stuff. They don't have the same kind of consumer culture there. It's more like respect the business and their rules. But anyway, now we're going to develop some ethical theories. Last thing I'm going to say about this before I cross it off the board is this. There's a logical relationship between this topic and this topic. And here's what I mean. Not doing what is impermissible is always an obligation. So like the negation of something morally impermissible is always obligatory. So right, murder is impermissible. We can agree on that. So according to what I just said, that means that you have a moral obligation to not murder or to not lie, cheat, steal, rape, whatever. On the other hand, not doing what you're obligated to do, that's impermissible. So if I have a moral obligation to keep my promises, or let's say like to pay for the meal at the end after I've already eaten the food, then that's a moral obligation. So it is impermissible not to do that, right? Impermissible not to keep the promise. Impermissible not to pay the bill once the service has been rendered. Marriage vows, I guess, would be a very special case of a promise with a lot of significance. So you can say that the violation of those vows, infidelity, whatever, might be a violation of a moral obligation, if not an illegal act. Okay, so moral theory, that's what we're going to try and tunnel into now. So as I've said, philosophy tries to help provide answers to these big questions about what makes actions right, wrong, or even obligatory. And there are different ethical theories. The first one is by this guy. His name is John Stuart Mill, sometimes just abbreviated J.S. Mill, and he lived from 1806 to 1873. And so he was a British philosopher and a political economist. He also briefly served in the British Parliament, which is like the British equivalent of the Congress here in the United States. So he was a legislator and a lawmaker at one point in his life as well. Just a little background on Mill. He's got an interesting mix of views that we're going to learn a lot about at different points throughout the semester, starting today. But I guess in terms of his political views, he would be what we would call today like a libertarian, meaning that he believed in limited government, and he thought that the government should have the least power which is necessary for enforcing social order, but no more than that. So like he would, for example, be a person who thought that if individuals want to participate in self-regarding conduct that doesn't interfere with anyone else's interests, then even if it's not good for them, they should be tolerated or given the liberty to do it. So he was a person that argued in favor of like um, people being allowed to drink during a time when prohibition was debated in many places, or use drugs or gamble or seek out prostitution, because in all those different examples, there are actions which some people dislike, but that don't really interfere with the interests of others. So he would be one person that thinks you should give people their liberty to do those things. At the same time, he was also progressive on a lot of issues. He believed in the worldwide abolition of slavery. He thought that women should be given the right to vote at a time when women were not allowed to vote in the United States and in many other places. So interesting man with different views. But the legacy that he left behind that he's most well known for are his writings on ethics and his development of a theory called utilitarianism. So we're going to have to learn about John Stuart Mill's theory called utilitarianism. Okay, so let me make sure that's easy and clear by putting it one time in the chat, because it's sort of sometimes a tricky word, the way it's spelled and everything. Okay, utilitarianism. So utilitarianism is an ethical theory which defines the morality of an act in terms of the consequences that the action has. So that is why sometimes utilitarianism is called a member of the consequentialist school of thought. So here's another piece of terminology. We're going to back away from this for a minute, define what consequentialism is, and then we'll return back to the utilitarian definition. So consequentialism. What consequentialism says is that the morality of an action is defined by its consequences. Okay, so that's the idea here, that if a person abides by consequentialist moral thinking, then they do think that the moral status of the action, so whether it's morally permissible, impermissible, or obligatory, that is going to depend on what the consequences of the action are. So if the consequences that come from the action are somehow good ones, then that's a good act, that's right morally. Or, on the other hand, if the consequences that come from the action are bad in some sense, then that's a bad action, that's wrong morally. Consequences. Those are just the effects that result from whatever a person does. And every action that people do, at least most, have some consequences, whether they be good or bad. So maybe some of you have heard this word consequences in your life, and you think of it in an exclusively negative sense, like, oh, are there going to be consequences if I cheat or something? And yes, consequences can be bad, but they can be good too. So this word is neutral on whether they're good or bad, but whether they are good or bad will determine the morality of the example action that we're talking about. So like, for example, suppose that you help your friends study for their test. You help them prepare, and because you put in that time with them, they end up acing the test and doing really well. So that would be like a positive consequence of your decision to help. On the other hand, suppose that you get your friend really drunk the night before the exam and you stay up all night with them, so that prevents them from studying. Now they go into the test hungover, and so like a negative consequence of doing that is that they fail their test. So utilitarians abide by consequentialist thinking. If I was going to give you a metaphor for the logical relationship between these two concepts, it's like this. Utilitarianism is a species of consequentialism. Okay, so consequentialism is like a more umbrella term underneath which utilitarianism and a few other theories fall. In parallel with that, we are human beings, but we all belong, that's our species, but we belong to the broader category of animals that are called mammals, right? So like within the mammal category, there are so many different warm-blooded, live birth creatures, cats, tigers, bears, dogs, and we are one species of those. So Consequentialism is the broader concept. Utilitarianism is one member of the consequentialist family. Here's just a little cartoon image to give you a visual depiction of what I'm trying to explain. Say this is a person here, this little stick figure, and then they do an action, they do something. This arrow stands for the passage of time. And at the tail end of the arrow, I'm drawing the letter C, and I'm just highlighting it in that way. That letter will say stands for the consequences that come from what they did. So in consequentialist and utilitarian thought, it is this stuff here, the results that follow after your acts, that will define whether it was right or wrong. So you're supposed to always be thinking ahead as to what the probable consequences or results will be, and acting in the way that will generate good ones as opposed to bad ones. Now, that's consequentialism, and like I said, that gives us enough background to speak more specifically now about the utilitarian version of consequentialism. So utilitarians say the consequences matter for morality, but which ones? They say the consequences that matter morally are those that bear on overall human happiness. And so this is the motto and the creed, the lifestyle that you live by if you're going to be a utilitarian. They say act always to promote the greatest amount of overall happiness for the greatest number of people. So I'm writing that down. Act always to promote the greatest amount of overall happiness for the greatest number of people. Okay, so that right there is the written, just capsule statement of what utilitarian ethics is all about. Act always so that when you act, you're going to cause the greatest amount of overall happiness to result for the greatest number of people. So if you're going to operate according to this principle, let me see some questions here. Does it derive from the economic definition of utility, you ask, Robert? Good question. So utility is sort of similar to the economic definition of it, but it's stated more in terms of pleasure. So this is actually something I was just going to mention in a moment, but since your question is on the table, I'll get to it right now. Happiness, they claim, is equivalent to pleasure and the absence of pain. Okay, so let me put that term up here. And in the theory of utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill also refers to what he calls the reverse of happiness, which is what we should try to minimize. And the reverse of happiness is just defined in contrast to the definition of happiness. So if happiness is pleasure in the absence of pain, some of you might be able to guess what the reverse of it is. It's blank and blank, namely pain and the absence of pleasure. Okay, so getting back to the chat here. A question I received in the DM here says, aren't there things that make people happy but that aren't necessarily good for them? Probably that's true, but in the judgment of the utilitarians, it's pleasure and the maximization of it overall that we should regard as the moral standard to judge all of our conduct by. Now, I know what you mean, though. So you might be thinking of a case where someone desires, I don't know, physical pain, like a masochist type of person. And that is in some way psychologically pleasurable to them, even if it is like physically harmful to themselves. It's complicated to question then whether that is promoting the principle of utility or not. But certainly utilitarians would be more favorable to looking at those acts as morally benign than perhaps some other theorists, just because the only goal to measure all actions by is how much pleasure is generated. And pleasure can be construed very broadly as whatever makes somebody happy or minimizes pain. Now, most amount of good for the most amount of people. Yes, that's a fair way to put it. So act always to promote the greatest amount of overall happiness for the greatest number of people. So think about it as a person trying to live this way. They would, first of all, evaluate what their options are in any given situation. So say you had like 4 optional choices to make in terms of doing something, A, B, C, and D. The utilitarian would say, okay, you're now going to try and judge what the total amount of happiness would be that would result from each of these options. And whichever one you think would generate the most overall, that's the one that is your moral obligation. That's the morally obligatory action to do in that case. Now, what are some reasons that the author gives to make this seem reasonable and plausible, so it just doesn't sound like he's dictating to you? He has a couple of additional bases of support that he offers here. So one principle that is supposed to back this up is what he calls the greatest happiness principle. Okay. So there's 2 kind of subsidiary claims here that help to, he thinks, stand up and prop up and give basis to this idea of utilitarianism. One is called the greatest happiness principle. Okay, and so the greatest happiness principle just says that actions are right morally to the degree that they promote happiness, and actions are wrong morally to the extent that they promote the reverse of happiness. So here we go. Actions are right to the extent that, so it's a matter of degree, so they can be more or less on the scale, but they're right to the extent that they promote happiness. And likewise, wrong to the extent that they promote the reverse of happiness. Little limitation of word space, and wrong to the extent that they promote the reverse of happiness. That's what I'm writing here. So there you have that greatest happiness principle on the board. It says, actions are right insofar as they promote happiness, and they're wrong insofar as they promote the reverse. So combining that with the definition of happiness and the reverse of it here, all it's saying is, and he believes this is deeply embedded in everyone's common sense, if somebody commits an act and that action generates pleasure or takes pain away from people, then it's good. And the more of it that does, then the better and better it is morally on the moral scale. So I'm going to give you just a random example, but suppose that somebody took it upon themselves to face danger and rush into a burning building to recover people inside that are trapped in the smoke and burning building. So if they did that and they managed to save somebody who otherwise could not have escaped, preventing their death, then they prevented all the pain that would have come from the physical event of death, but also they've prevented all the emotional anguish and pain that their loved ones and friends would have suffered if they would have had to grieve their loss. Furthermore, they've secured all the future pleasure that the person would never have experienced if they had perished at that moment. So all the future events and experiences that they now can enjoy remain in the world. So if they did that and they saved this one person, most anybody would probably say it's a fair statement that what they did was morally good. And since it's to the extent that, right, so imagine that they saved not 1, but 2, 3, 4, they got 10 people out. This just sort of compounds the moral goodness of how good the act was. So there could be more or less. On the other hand, take the person who's the arsonist, who has set fire to the building. Now, if because he has set the fire, a consequence of it is that somebody perishes in the flames, thereby extinguishing all their future happiness and pleasure, and also imposing upon them a ton of bad pain in the event of death itself, that action's wrong and bad. And if they caused one person to be harmed or die in this way, that's bad enough. But if they did it to 2, 5, 10, if we get into like a Hitler figure, trying to exterminate whole races of people, we're now getting into worse and worse moral conduct. So it's just the principle that he thinks is intuitive to everybody's common sense. He says all you have to do is really reflect on the things that you want. You want happiness and pleasure. You do not want pain or to be removed from having happiness. So he thinks it's a fair principle to live by. Try your best when you act. To do whatever act will generate more rather than less happiness, certainly not cause pain. Now, question here. Couple comments. Robert, you say, so this takes into account opportunity cost, not the immediate happiness. Well, it takes into account all of it, actually, Robert. Not just the immediate outcomes, but all those that follow from the events that, or the actions that one takes. So both are inclusive, yes. I have another question from a DM which says, but what if they hurt themselves in the process of saving the people, causing themselves pain? Well, good question. If, for example, they lost their own life in an attempt to save another, then the value of what is saved versus what is lost is canceled out. And so that doesn't necessarily have any kind of affirmative moral quality in that case. Now, Carl, what if the person they saved was covered and burned so badly that their quality of life was only pain? Well, you have an interesting question there. I think most people would probably prefer the at least limited pleasures that they could continue to enjoy by just being alive, period, than to not have to suffer through them, knowing that it means that that's the annihilation of their existence. So, I mean, is it possible for a very clever utilitarian to argue that the better choice is to allow them to perish in the flames rather than to survive a long term? Maybe. But that's also changing the case a little bit, because I didn't imply in my first statement of it that that would be the result. But if you modify the hypothetical, then maybe it does have a different moral outcome according to the theory. That's fair. Okay, so one more thing I want to say to try and give a basis for the theory, which Mill also mentions, is this. He says another reason that this theory is something that should be agreeable to you, that should sound, he thinks, common sense, is this reason. He argues, or he claims, that happiness, or since it's equivalent to pleasure for him, we'll just use them interchangeably, happiness / pleasure, he says, that is the only thing in the whole world that each of us desires as an end instead of as a means. Okay, so let me put that here and then we'll explain it together. Claim from Mill. Happiness / pleasure, which is, same, is the only thing that we pursue as an end and not as a means. So what I have there is the statement that happiness or pleasure, and this is a claim from Mill to further reinforce the plausibility of his argument or theory, happiness or pleasure is the only thing that we pursue as an end, not as a means. Knowing that, he says, it should even be more clear that this is the proper type of way to think about morality. But for all of us to know what he's saying, we have to think about and understand what these words mean, end and means. Okay, so I'm going to help you think about those words for a moment. And let me try and tease it out from a phrase that I think many of you have heard before, and that will kind of guide you into the understanding of this statement. So let me ask the group, have any of you guys ever heard of the statement that the ends justify the means, or that sometimes the ends justify the means? Yes? Okay, good. So to those that have a feel for this statement, I would love to hear from you. What does that mean? In other words, when somebody says the ends justify the means, what are they saying? Suppose that you're getting this question from your little sibling and they're not well aware of the meaning of the phrase. So now it's your job to teach them, or at least try to explain it. The ends justify the means. Now, Christian, you say as long as we win, sort of. Yes, but we got to have a little more detail. Joseph, you say the ends are the ultimate consequences and the means are the actions leading to the consequence. Very good. Robert, you say the result was worth the damage done to get there. And that's another good way to put it. So based on all your good, fair statements here, let me try and put my own way of saying it. And Carl, you say it's morally permissible to do something that would otherwise be morally impermissible as long as the consequence ends in happiness. Sort of, yes. Okay, so here's what it means. The ends justify the means says this, that if you have a goal which is important enough, then the things that you have to do to arrive at that goal or to achieve it can be justified, even if sometimes these actions that lead you to the goal are by themselves considered unfavorable or they're frowned upon. So, in other words, what is an end then? Now that I've said it and we've talked about it a little bit, an end is simply a more fancy sounding academic word for not peace, Aaron, but rather, you've got it, Sarah, it's an outcome, but even a little more detailed. It's a desired outcome. And so that's right, Brian, it's a goal. Because sometimes outcomes are just what happens, but an end is a desired, intended outcome. So it is a goal or an objective. So that's right. Ends are just goals. Now, what are means? If the ends justify the means, and the ends are the goals that you're striving towards, then the means are what in relationship to these ends? They are the things that what? Just another way of saying what means are, but you can say it. They are the things that you do to achieve the goal. That's right, Robert. So they are the actions that you take or the methods that you use to accomplish or to achieve those ends or objectives. So good. These are the actions taken or methods used, basically, to achieve one's goals. Okay, ends, goals. Means, whatever you do to get there. So going back last time to that statement, ends justify the means. Suppose that somebody, let me think of a good example. They steal something, but they do it to feed, a starving child, like we said earlier. Or they tell a lie. Here's a good example. They tell a lie, but they do it to protect someone's feelings. So like somebody asks them, do you like the meal that I cooked? And they thought it was disgusting, but if they tell them the truth, they're going to hurt their feelings. So instead, they just lie. And they might say, well, the goal of making them feel good justifies the act of lying in this case. Or, the goal that I have of feeding my child makes it okay that I stole a loaf of bread. Okay, so coming back then to Mill's statement. What he's saying in this, now that we know what ends and means are, we can fully understand this. It says, happiness or pleasure is the only goal that we're pursuing in life as human beings. Nothing else is the goal. Everything else that you want, if you want it, is only desired as a means towards the real goal of happiness. So nothing is desired for its own sake except happiness itself. Anything else you want, whether those are possessions, experiences, certain types of relationships, certain states of mind, it's simply because you think that they're a means towards the attainment of the pleasure and happiness that you really do want. Now, I see a question in the DMs about the whole thing of the cooking example. Wouldn't that hurt them in the long run because they can't improve their cooking? Perhaps. That might be a fair point. I'm just saying that the person who does it believing that it's morally innocent would probably describe their action in this way, right? They wouldn't say, oh, I did it because I like to lie. They would say, I don't usually lie. But in this case, it was a little white lie because the goal behind the lie was not to harm, but rather to protect someone's feelings or whatever. But you're making a reasonable point if you think that the lie itself might compound to worse consequences in the future. I only use it as a passing example. But as I was saying just now, according to Mill, why is it that we should erect this whole system of ethics based on the motive, the promotion of overall happiness and pleasure? Why is that the right standard? Well, he says the reason that's the North Star of ethics is because each one of us in our everyday lives is already pursuing happiness for ourselves, and that's the goal of everything that you're doing. Now, every time I teach this topic, I try to walk all the students through a quick analysis of your own present situation so that at least this will seem like it's ballpark reasonable. So let's ask right now. One thing I know you're doing on purpose for some reason is attending this class. Right now you're here. So I'm glad that you're here, but I have a question. What is the end behind doing this? Like this class, the fact that you're now watching this lecture, what are you trying to get by that? This is a means to something. So what is the goal and the objective behind you being here today?
Did you call my name?
Sorry?
Oh, did you say Rasul? Sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead. I just said anybody, but you can say it.
Oh, GE. Definitely.
Okay, GE, good. Okay, good. So let's take it slowly, step by step. You're in the class attending the lecture, and I'm assuming you're doing it because you think then you can pass the class because you'll, be informed on the content and you'll do well on the tests and such. So your attendance is a means towards that good grade. But why do you want that good grade in this class, Sarah? It's sort of for the reason Rasul and some others gave, because the good grade in this class allows you to satisfy, let's say, a graduation requirement. Now, why do you want to satisfy that GE? That is a means to something else. And I guess, Sarah, you're already on top of it. You want to satisfy this general education requirement as a means towards another goal, which is to graduate. But we're not done yet. Why do you want to graduate? Do you just like the idea of wearing the cap and gown? Okay, yeah, because graduation is a means towards gaining employment in a career or something like that, right? I'm sure most of you want to graduate college because of your employment and financial prospects. So let's take it slow, going back to the beginning one more time. You're attending this class as a means towards getting a good grade in it. And that good grade in this class is going to be one part of the means towards your eventual graduation. And then you want to graduate and hold the degree as a means towards being competitive in looking for a job or career. Now, why do you want the job or career? Do you just like the idea of labor? You just say, put me to work. That's what I want to do. Why do you want the career? I know you want it, but it's a means to something else. You want a job as a means to getting money. All right, good. Now, why do you want the money? Is it just because you like to do origami with the money? You like to frame it and put it on the wall? Why do you want money? Money you want, yes. But as a means to what? To provide for yourself, right? So money literally is a means. It's not desired for its own sake, but as a medium of exchange. You want the money, but the reason you want it is so that you can have purchasing power for goods and services and financial security. So now we're really at the very end. If you want to have purchasing power for goods and services and financial security, why do you want that? Why do you want all that purchasing power and financial security? What's the reason you want it? Because you think it'll lead to what? I think some of you have said it, but just say it again. Happiness. That's right. Happiness. So all the things that you're doing are in the pursuit of personal happiness, aren't they? If you could be convinced that going to college is not going to make you happy, that it's just going to burden you with a bunch of debt and you'll never get gainful employment, I guarantee you would probably reconsider your choices right now, because you do believe, and it's a fair thing and it's a reasonable thing, you do believe that the things you're doing will tend towards your ultimate happiness. Otherwise, why do anything? And so what Mill is saying is that anytime you think about the things you're doing, it will terminate in the final goal of getting to happiness. And if I ask you why you want happiness, it's okay at that point to just shrug your shoulders and be like, come on, what do you want from me? Like, that's just basic. Everyone wants happiness, right? And so that's all that this is really saying in the end. Behind our complex discussion, Mill is saying that happiness is the universal goal of every human being. And so if happiness is my goal, your goal, his, her goal, everyone's, then why not make the promotion of it overall to the maximum degree the standard that we judge morality by? Yeah, so happiness and pleasure is the only thing we're pursuing as an end, not as a means. If you want to travel to certain parts of the world, have certain kinds of relationships, build a family, you're doing it because you think that there's pleasure and happiness in that. And if you thought otherwise, then there would be no value in doing it. So, yes, good comments all around, everybody. So next thing then is this. If the goal of life and morality and what judges the morality of an action is how much happiness is promoted, I sometimes like to walk you guys through a little hypothetical scenario where this theory can be put into practice, so you can sort of see how it might work in an arbitrary example. So here's how the rest of the meeting is going to basically go today. I'm going to talk to you guys about how the theory of utilitarianism might approach a given choice situation. And then I have a few last remarks to make about it. It'll probably take about 20 minutes or so at the beginning on Monday, but that's fine. And then we'll start to talk about the second ethical theory, which is a big rival to this utilitarian stuff, and it's a major contrast. That's the work of Kant and Kantian ethics. But let's build this up a little more. So to see how the theory might work in a real practical case, I'm going to draw this little graph. And what it is a box. And in the box, we're going to have 4 columns, like so. And then we're going to cross those 4 columns with 4 horizontal rows, which of course creates a grid containing 16 boxes in this bigger structure. Now, to the top 4 columns, I'm going to place 4 headings. And each one is going to be a different type of well-known pizza topping variety. Okay, so you guys all know about pizza. What is one well-known type of pizza topping option that people can choose, that sometimes they choose? Pepperoni. Okay, so this letter P will stand for pepperoni, that column. What's another one? Cheese. Okay, good. C for cheese. I see someone saying mushroom. That's letter M. And then we need one more. Pineapple. Okay, so it's always controversial, isn't it? But letter P sub I. Pineapple versus pepperoni, not to be confused with each other. Okay. Now, to do the rest of this, I just need a couple of students here to help me. And it's going to be very minor participation, but I'll just ask you to give me basically your rating of which pizzas you prefer and at what degree. So let me know. Someone in the chat here, volunteer and tell me that I can put your name on the left side because I'm going to need 4 names. Who's available? Okay, Madeline, thanks. So Madeline, that's you. You're row number 1. The second one, Aaron, that's you. Row number 2. Row 3, Sarah, or sorry, I see, well, there's a whole bunch of us actually. Madeline, Aaron, I'm going to go with Sarah because I said it first. Here you are, Sarah Javier in that row. And Joseph, how about that? So we got 2 of each. Okay, so now, in these boxes, notice this, that each of the 16 boxes can assign a name to a pizza topping variety. So like this box would stand for like Aaron cheese, or this box like Sarah pineapple. Now, to the 4 names here, to you 4 guys, I want you to just think of this specific question. I'm going to ask you to give a number between, and the range is going to be limited to 0 through 50, just to keep it within a reasonable frame. And this number that you're going to report, if I ask you, is going to be like the pleasure score that you would award to that pizza topping variety based on your interests, right? So like, you know, if you like one better than the other, that should be reflected in the numeric score that you give. You know how sometimes people say like 10 out of 10 would recommend and all that? Well, this is sort of like that, but it's ranking it in terms of pleasure quantity, which I know is a bit of an imprecise thing. You might be saying, well, how can I really assign a numeric equivalent to how much pleasure I feel when that choice is made? But do your best, you know? So like, if you like something twice as much, you would give it twice the value. If you like something not at all and there's no pleasure in it for you, then that would be like a 0 or at least very low. So 50, I guess, would represent like that's your favorite one or nothing else you find more pleasure in. So then let's go ahead to Madeline. We got 4 different types. And so we're going to hear 4 different numbers. Starting with pepperoni, what do you say, Madeline? 50. So just fully maxed out. You're a pepperoni lover. No problem with that. So that's a lot of pleasure. Moving to the next, cheese. What do you say? 10. Okay, not a big fan of cheese. Is it boring to you? I don't know, maybe. But that's you, and that's fine. So that's cheese. Next, we have mushroom, and that's what? 30. Okay, good. I'm a mushroom fan, so we can agree on that. And then pineapple? 0. Okay, so just I knew there'd be powerful views on the pineapple. There's no love for that for you, at least, so no pleasure. That's fine. No, it's good. Thanks, Madeline. So next, it's Aaron, and same thing. So let's go through it. Aaron, what do you say to pepperoni? 50. Okay, so another very strong preference on that. No dislike at all. Okay, then we got cheese, and cheese you're saying 25. Okay, good. All right, now we move to the next, which is mushroom. 40. Okay. A little better than the cheese, and then pineapple. 20. Okay, so it's not like you totally dislike it, but if you had to choose, it would be the least favorite for you. Okay, someone asked me in the DM, what if you just eat anything? Well, you know, try your best to come up with some type of distinctions at least. But I mean, that can be. Some people might just be like 25 across the board, no preferences. Fair enough. It's every individual's got their own views. But yeah, Sarah's the next. So let me know, what's the next pepperoni score here? Sarah Javier, 25. Okay, good. And then 35. Okay, a little more. Mushroom is 20. Yes. And then the pineapple, big winner, 50. Okay, somebody had to love it, and that's good. You know, I'm not very passionate about the pineapple question. I know that some people love it or hate it, and I'm kind of in the middle, but good. Moving to Joseph, let us know, pepperoni. Okay, 50, 40, 30, 20. That's clear enough. Okay, now, what does utilitarianism tell us to do? It says to do the action that's going to generate what? The most overall happiness for the greatest number of people. So now in this situation here, we can do a little math, a little mathematical, simple arithmetic to determine which of the actions, in terms of choosing a pizza topping here, would be the one that would be resulting in most overall pleasure. What math do I have to do here? I will have to simply, we have 4 columns. with 4 types of pizza toppings. So who thinks they can tell me? You say add and divide, Sarah? Sort of. I mean, in that way you can get an average, but it's rather the grand total that matters in utilitarian world. So you actually shall just get the sum. And Robert, I guess you're already there. I'll double check your math, but I trust that it's correct. 175 is the total in this column. And cheese, 35, 35, 70, 110. And that's what you have there. 120, 70, 90, yes, 120. And then finally, we've got 70, 90, yeah. Okay, now, if this is the breakdown of preferences and so forth, we have the now clear result. Which of the choices would be the moral obligation? Which choice is morally obligatory to this group? It is pepperoni, yes. So I'm going to put a little asterisk there. Why is it? It's because this action dominates the others in terms of promoting more total happiness for the affected group than any of the other options does. Now, is everybody perfectly happy? Does everybody get their most favored choice? Well, you guys could have made it a little more interesting by having more diversity of interests, but I guess, if it's a pepperoni group, that's what it is. But at least with you, Sarah Javier, that you can provide me the material to make this point here. So like for Sarah, is she getting her favorite pizza? No. But is it still right to order this in this ethical theory? Yes, because it's not about satisfying everyone to the greatest degree individually. It's rather by just getting the thing that creates the most total happiness for everybody. Now, if Sarah was by herself and her choice affected nobody else, then certainly the utilitarian principle would say she should order this time because that's more total happiness for that affected group of one. And so in utilitarianism, sometimes you have to, as they say, like take one for the team. If you have to concede on your preferred action in order to get to the result that generates the most happiness for all. But in this scenario here, the preference of most is satisfied by ordering that. And although in some cases there are other alternatives that provide more pleasure, at least with the case of Sarah, this is the optimific action. Now here's another piece of terminology, the word optimific. This is just a piece of jargon that is sometimes used in utilitarian discussion. Pepperoni gang, yes. Optimific just refers to the choice within your spectrum of options that uniquely maximizes total utility. So in this example, pepperoni is the optimific action, and therefore it stands as the moral obligation. So if you're one of these 4 people and it was your duty or, let's say, role to make the order, and you knew these facts, then according to the theory of utilitarianism, you'd be doing something immoral to choose one of the others. Say you were Sarah and you opted for your preferred choice. It would actually generate the least total utility for the whole group, and therefore, although it's suitable to her self-interest, it's not the utilitarian right decision. Now, Joseph, you saying, could we derive from this that sometimes the most utilitarian choice is not the most equitable? Yes, you can definitely do that, Joseph. Very good point. Now, this is something that I wanted to mention, and you give me a good sort of window into doing that right now. Let me mess with the numbers one time, and I'm going to break some of the rules that we have here, just to make a point, which is perfectly in line with your comment, Joseph. So sometimes people find fault with utilitarianism because it cannot guarantee equity. That's right. You might think, oh, it's just majority wins. Sometimes, yes. But in fact, it's not about a majority. It's rather what generates the most total quantity of happiness, as though it's a measurable sum of something. So imagine that we have this situation. I guess I shouldn't have deleted these. This is 175, 110, and then this was 120. Now, suppose that in this case here, this is the breakdown. Aaron, Joseph, no love for pineapple at all. But when it comes to Sarah, we're breaking our rules a little bit. It's this. Okay, so like in this case, Sarah has like overwhelming, like outrageous, euphoric pleasure when pineapple pizza is consumed to such an extent that it overwhelms the total pleasure that all the other people could enjoy with any of the other options. Now, in this version of the case, where we've tweaked the values, what's the morally obligatory choice? I'm just setting it up for you, but just tell me one time. In this version of events, the right action, so to speak, quote unquote, according to the theory, is pineapple, yes. But it's a bit weird, isn't it? And Joseph, this is kind of what you were mentioning, right? Can an inequitable distribution of pleasure be the right call? In theory, yes. In this case, Sarah is, there's a term for this type of person in these scenarios. It's what's called a utility monster. the utility monster idea is actually sometimes given as a criticism, a critique of utilitarian theory. Because in utilitarianism, there's no requirement strictly that everyone has like the highest average of pleasure. It's just what creates the greatest total in the end. So in this case, 3 people are going to have no pleasure at all, but they're going to have Sarah rolling around on the floor, like just going nuts, loving this to such an extent that that's actually the more optimistic choice. Now, some people might say that's a reason to dismiss the theory because, you know, I don't know, suppose you could have a scenario where like slave labor generates so much happiness for those that profit off of it that even the conditions of servitude and bondage they're living in are outweighed by the total pleasure of society, right? So yes, there could be the gross inequities. But what clever utilitarians will usually say is that those are merely theoretical possibilities. In real life, there usually is not a utility monster. And at least in the case of slavery, they would probably also argue that the harms and pains suffered by the slaves outweigh the marginal gains in utility that the beneficiaries of the system would have. But it's certainly one possible objection. And let me see some of your comments here. Sarah, you say, so basically, if Sarah wants pineapple way more than they want pepperoni, that would be the better decision. Yes, hypothetically, in the kind of case that I've constructed here. Now, you may look at that and say, oh, the theory's flat out wrong, but sometimes we do have that intuition. I don't know, like here's an example, and we're running low on time, but I'll close with this. Sometimes you might want to see like a film, and or you want to just go out to the movies, and you have like a group of 3 people, or 4. And suppose that 3 out of the 4 people would love to see like a certain movie, but they're not super interested in it. And the 4th person is, let's say, like a little child or whatever, and they're like obsessed over the moon with like this children's film that the other 3 like adults might not like that much. They would tolerate it, they would find some of it enjoyable, but the child would go nuts if they don't see this movie. So you might say that although there's 3 people who would probably prefer to see something else, the greater good is served by letting the one person have their way, since so much total happiness is bound up with the satisfaction of their preference than the others. So the utility monster thing can sometimes be construed as like a fatal flaw of the theory, but others might just say it's a rare circumstance which, in case it ever pops up, can theoretically be morally justified. So this is just kind of you guys' first taste of utilitarian theory. I have a little more to say on it when we return after the weekend, but this is the big basic idea. So I'm just going to say a couple of comments to close. Pizza party when we go back in person, yeah, I guess it's going to have to be pepperoni for you guys. But Sarah, maybe we'll get half and half or something for your sake. No, but I don't know. If it wasn't COVID and everything, I would do that. I used to do that when we did review sessions at the end. Now I'm just worried about making everybody get in touch with each other and stuff, but it's fine. A whole pineapple, sure, maybe just a personal one. Yeah, no problems there. So like just to recap a couple of summary statements, we're studying ethics. Ethics is the study of morality and moral concepts. In ethics, we think of actions in terms of whether they're right, wrong, good, bad, moral, immoral, just or unjust. There's 3 main types of action in ethics: those that are morally permissible, impermissible, or obligatory. And we talked about what each of those means and what are some examples. Now, one theory of ethics that tries to fill in the gaps as to what makes acts right or wrong or obligatory is the utilitarian theory given by John Stuart Mill, famous British philosopher and economist. And he said that the right actions are those that generate the most overall happiness for the greatest number of people. He said that this makes sense because happiness is the only thing that we're all pursuing as a goal anyway. Everything else is just a means to that goal. And also because it just seems intuitive that actions are better and better morally the more happiness they create, and they're worse and worse morally the more pain they cause or the more happiness they take away. Then looking at how to apply the theory in a hypothetical scenario, I just showed you how, like, if you could evaluate the preferences of the different people, then you'd try to make the choice that would generate the most total value or happiness for the whole group. Now, we're not all made happy by the same exact things. I just want to say one last thing. Some of us are big thrill seekers. Like I talk to students and they'll say, oh, you know, I went bungee jumping, skydiving, whatever, and whitewater rafting, and they talk about how much fun they had, and that's great. They have fun doing that. For me, though, I'm much more risk averse, and I can tell you right now, I will never skydive or bungee jump just on the sheer anxiety that I think I would feel doing it. So here's one action that one of us that's the most fun thing ever. To the other person, it's traumatizing. You're gonna have nightmares forever. Do we disagree though on wanting pleasure? No, we just find it in different sources. So some people like, you know, going to the opera. Some people are like, what's an opera? You know, I just want to, I don't know, party and do other things. but we're all pursuing happiness. That's Mill's point. And so in whatever way we can evaluate the quantity of it, we should try to create more than less. Okay, guys, so that's everything I wanted to say for the moment. I guess I'll let you go, but stay following the class announcements that I send out like you did today, and you'll find the next link for the Monday meeting and for the Monday office hours as well. So are we all good? Let me know if you want to say goodbye one time, and then I'll close the stream. Okay, thanks so much. I'll send you a recorded version of this lecture too, and you should be good to go until next week. So if you need anything, email me anytime, and I'll be available. But until then, have a great one. Have a good weekend, and I'll see you back on Monday. So thanks.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.